Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is a deep, subterranean nightmare that I'm sure you can all sink your teeth into. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Walking Without Light, Part 1. Let's get straight into that. I'm not the kind of person who believes in the paranormal, not without what I would consider definitive proof. Sure, I'm willing to admit I indulge in tales of cryptids and enjoy theorizing that perhaps, somewhere, somehow, some aberration of natural life has evolved into the lesser-known places of the world without us knowing. But I've never gone so far as to unquestioningly commit myself to the belief that things like Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Dogman, Mothman and all those kinds of beings exist. I think for me it's more of an interest, even if it's a fantastical one. I've always sort of liked the idea of unnamed horrors, slinking about in dark spaces of the world, lanky, pale-skinned humanoids lurking in the night out in the deep woods, and weird hybrid creatures running amok in the back country, and flying oddities swooping overhead, leaving people wondering what they just saw. But for the most part, dear reader, I'm sure you'll be a little disappointed to hear that I, unlike many people here, am something of a skeptic. And although I still proudly wear that badge, I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me a few years ago, a story about a misadventure, an ordeal that I survived. Not by luck, but by sheer determination. This is the story of how I had my skepticism challenged to the 9th degree. This is the story of what I found deep below the earth during the heat and haze of a Nevada summer in July of 2018. I'm going to start this off by extending my preface a little more. I'm a weird guy. Not follow you home and sniff your discarded laundry weird, but more of I do weird and probably quite dangerous dumb shit kind of weird. And what's worse, I tend to do a lot of it alone. Now I know what you're thinking. Another dumb urbex story where he's like, oh, I'm a badass. I don't really get scared. Well, no. In fact, it's the opposite. I'm a fucking pussy. Like seriously, I get scared super easy. But I'm also super interested in weird shit, especially abandoned structures, and even more so when they're unmapped or pretty much completely forgotten about. It's this odd aspect of my life that brought me to Nevada wilderness in July of 2018. I had been watching a YouTuber for a while who explored abandoned mines, and I lived in the UK at the time and really wanted to expand from just looking around old factories and churches to something different. Now I knew that mines were a different beast entirely, and most of the time exploring abandoned mines was closer to spelunking than urbex. But I was desperate to go exploring in one of these forgotten subterranean networks. For my first week in America, I had hooked up with a few groups of fellow urbex/mine exploration guys, and mainly I stuck with them. We tended to look at smaller mines, and when we came across the larger ones, we rarely ventured too far from the portal, the entrance to the mine. I longed for solitude, as was often the case with my adventuring, and so I took those initial trips as time for research and note-taking, so that I could be as safe as possible when I decided to go it alone. Along with the usual gear that you would probably expect these guys to use, ropes, boots, waders, torches, oxygen meters, food, water, yarn to retrace your steps, etc. I also found that hanging out with these guys actually helped me with a few items I probably wouldn't have even thought about had I gone it alone. For example, this one dude, Jay, I think his name was, always carried a backpack with at least one extra jumper, a jacket, gloves, socks and underwear. One, because you can get wet underground, especially in mines that hit water seams, and two, because the further down you go, the colder it gets, and extra layers and gloves can seriously help with the cold, especially if you're fiddling with a camera or a torch. The last thing you'd need is your hands going numb and dropping your only source of light, which is also why he also stressed the importance of carrying multiple torches and extra batteries. I also learned about keeping a knife or some sort handy, so you can cut ropes and prise things open. One girl also mentioned to me that sometimes it made you feel better when you're armed, and so she always carried a little .32 revolver with her. But most of the others there said you really don't run into many people in the mines, and usually the ones you do are just looking around like you are. And to be honest, as soon as she mentioned a gun, I flinched away from the subject. I mean, a knife, sure, but a gun? I'm from the UK, which means I've pretty much never seen a gun. I've never even heard one. The one time I'd ever seen a gun is when they're being carried by armed police or the police stationed at airports, and that's it. So when this chick starts casually talking about walking around with a pistol, I was a little taken aback. Hopefully, I wouldn't bump into her on my solo exploration and end up getting my ass shot by a jumpy girl with a gun at the bottom of a damn mine. After I'd finished my tour of some of the smaller mines, I decided that a week's worth of amateur exploration with some groups was enough experience. Naive, I know, but that's just how I was back then. Brash and always in a rush for independence. Now, I'm a lot different, and it's all thanks to the series of events you're about to learn about. I decided it was worth getting an early start. One of the guys I'd hung out with had marked out a relatively unexplored mine way out in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I was pretty much untouched, mainly because of how isolated it was. And apparently, it had been a really productive mine back in the 20s, mining tin and silver. I'm not going to disclose the location or the name of this mine, or any details about the company that owned the claim, because I refuse to be responsible for anyone going out there and going through what I did. Anyway, as I was saying, I got an early start, getting up at 6 AM, and the sunlight was just starting to perforate over the thin, cheap net curtains in my motel room. I knew I need to keep it to myself, as the local law enforcement don't like people wandering around the mines, as they tend to get themselves lost and hurt, and the last thing I wanted, after flying thousands of miles from my home, was to have some cop ship me back home for trespassing. Now that'd be a fucking joke. I loaded up the rental car I had hired for my time here and punched in the satellite coordinates for the mine I had been given. The dude who gave me the tip had mentioned that I'd probably have a hard time getting right up to the portal by car, and that it'd be much easier to park a mile or so down the trail and head up on foot. And with that in mind, I double checked my backpack, water and food, ensuring that I had everything I needed, and I set off. The drive wasn't too bad, but it was long. The roads were fairly empty as it was a weekend and being so early in the morning. I knew that it helped me when I got there. The less people who saw me turn off in the direction of a closed mine, the better. It took me around 2.5 hours to get there. It made me realize just how huge America was. I mean, if I drove for 2.5 hours in any direction in England, I'd probably be halfway to one of the coastlines. When finally I found the trail, it was getting on around 8:45 AM, and by the time I parked the car in a secluded spot near some agave plants and hiked up to the portal, it was probably around 9:30 AM. And straight away I could smell the familiar smell I'd come to experience in the other mines I'd explored with the groups. A smell of old oil, damp and rotting wood. The heat was blistering by the time I had prepared myself at the portal, and so once I stepped inside, I was thankful for the shelter from the sun, and the cool temperature soothed my already burning skin. You don't really think about sunscreen when you go into a mine. I began to make my way into the mine, and ensured that I left a trail of twine which I tried to tie up wherever possible, so that I could find my way back to the portal, just as I'd been taught. Making my way inside, I found more and more evidence of the structures that once existed in the tunnels. The support beams became more built up and there were more ore chutes, mainly blocked off from where the veins had run dry. The minecart rails were still mainly intact, although the wooden sleepers were heavily rotted, and you could still clearly see the rails. Miners' graffiti was also sparsely populating the walls of the shaft, names and dates ranging from 1912 to 1920. I peered closer at the graffiti, chuckling to myself at the little drawings of old cars, horses and little miners with picks. I wandered on through the corridors, eventually coming to a wide junction. In the junction there was a small shack-like structure, and inside were some old wooden chairs, a table and even some little tins, which I imagine were used for food. The guy who tipped me off was right, it was pretty much untouched in here. The temperature was pretty cold in this part of the mine, and I glanced at my oxygen meter, which told me I was still safely within a normal range of oxygen. I sat on a small rock and decided to take a drink of water and decide which of the 4 new tunnels to follow. One of them I could see the end of from the junction, and so figured there was not much point in me venturing down that one. I looked around the junction, trying to see if there was anything that took my interest in any particular direction, when I then saw a rather large piece of graffiti. When I walked up closer to it, I saw that it read, "Voices hum in the deep, deep gloom. For us men, there is no room." Huh, I thought to myself as I regarded the words. Bit weird, I'm not gonna lie. But it kinda made me want to follow the tunnel a bit further. Maybe there were some cool ambient noises or something made by the flow of air. Well, to be honest, I was a little freaked out, but at the same time, like I mentioned before, my curiosity always seemed to get the better of me. Almost as instantly as I had entered the tunnel, I felt a huge difference in the atmosphere. It was almost like as soon as I had crossed the threshold from the junction into the tunnel, I felt apprehensive, almost like knowing you're walking into somewhere you shouldn't be. Or that feeling you used to get if you ever went into a staff-only room at school. Not scared, just kind of weird. I walked onwards for what seemed like maybe 15 minutes or so before coming to yet another junction. "That's odd," I said aloud to myself. It had 3 tunnels this time, but dead in the centre, there was this backpack. And before you get carried away, no, it wasn't mine. But it did remind me of my own backpack, and that, like a fucking moron, I had forgotten it. I worked my way back along the tunnel and found my own, and then once again turned around and moved back towards the second junction, cursing at my incompetence under my breath. And there it was, still sitting in the middle of the cave-like room. I walked over to it and cautiously gave it a kick. I didn't want to stick my hand in, just in case there was anything nasty in there, like sharp climbing tools or an open knife or even maybe needles. Hey, how was I supposed to know what other weirdos like to do in the dark abandoned mines? It fell onto its side and a small green and black object fell out of the half-zipped opening. I peered at it closely, realizing it was a flashlight handle. I kneeled and carefully raised the bag, opening it up. Inside were a couple of batteries, the flashlight, some bottles of water and an oxygen monitor, a little more expensive than mine. They looked new, and so it kind of unnerved me a bit. Surely whoever had this backpack wouldn't have just left these things here. I turned the bag over to the open front, and inside I found an even more unsettling sight. Within the front compartment was a wallet. Inside I found a driver's license and some cash. Actually, I found a lot of cash. Too much for this to have just been left here, like this. And seeing as this junction was so close to the exit, close enough to feel the change in the airflow, I knew that this meant whoever it belonged to was most likely still in the mine. Okay, I'm gonna level with you. It fucked me up a bit. The idea of being down here in the darkness with a fucking randomer wasn't nice. However, I figured there was nothing particularly malicious or alarming about what I had found. There were no drugs in the bag, no weapons to speak of, and nothing that indicated foul play. I decided to man up and call out into the darkness of the tunnels. I figured if this guy was still here, he was likely not far from the junction, and maybe left the bag here whilst he walked a short way down one of the tunnels. I called out the name on the driver's license into the tunnels a few times down each. The name I saw on the license was Matus, and I figured maybe this guy wasn't English, and so I wasn't entirely sure if he'd understand what I was saying. The license was an American one though, although it was from California rather than Nevada. I waited for what seemed like forever, in complete silence, listening at every little creak and crack and crumbling sound. I stood there in the most absolute stillness for the longest time, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own body working away. A thought occurred to me then, in that stillest of stills. What if he's watching you from back in one of those tunnels? You've got a powerful flashlight on, and you can't see what you're not aiming at. I exhaled a shaky breath and slowly clicked the flashlight off, and I was immediately plunged into the blackest black I have ever experienced. It's like being in an already dark room and then closing your eyes. I crouched down low to the floor as if this would somehow help me be less visible or conspicuous. I don't know why I thought that. Ever so slightly, painfully slowly, my eyes began to adjust to the darkness. There were just enough photons of light that I could only just make out some larger shapes. I could, for example, see the track switcher to the left of the junction. I could also just about make out one of the 3 tunnel entrances, although I wasn't sure if my mind was just adding these details in because I already knew that they were there, or not. Whilst I crouched there in the darkness, I listened. I listened so intently that I even began to hear the ambient sounds of the mine. That background static that you only hear when you're really shut down. You can sometimes hear it just as you fall asleep, and as I became more and more tuned into that sound, every little creak and crack became more like groans and bangs. Finally, I decided there was no one here, at least not nearby. But I felt almost a sense of duty to find out if there was. If someone was down here and they were stuck or lost, I felt like it would be such a huge waste if the only person who happened to wander here by chance just left when they were so close to salvation. I clicked my flashlight back on, whirling around the room. I aimed it back along the way I'd came. Nothing. I checked all 3 tunnels again, and nothing. I decided to do a little detective work. Firstly, I checked the license again. According to its tiny text, the man who it belonged to was 28 years old, only a few years older than myself. The license also told me that his license was valid from June of that year, and so he had only passed recently. A student, perhaps. If he hadn't been driving for that long, he must have had a reason not to, or maybe no need to do so. But then, he was pretty old for a student, unless maybe he was a med student. I checked his wallet for any other forms of ID, and found a few bank cards, and with his name printed on them. I then had a sudden light bulb moment. I took one of the water bottles from his bag. The expiry date on the label read January 19th, which meant that it was purchased or at least stocked on a shelf this month, as most water bottles have around a 6-month expiry date. I also noticed that, interestingly, the brand was the same as the brand all the local stores sold, meaning he had stopped in town before coming out to the mine. I started searching through his bag further, hoping to maybe find something else to indicate how long this guy had been down here. Obviously, there was always the chance he had left and forgotten his things down here, but I just don't see anyone just walking out and not remembering their belongings, especially a wallet with ID and cash. It was then that I heard a clinging noise, like the sound of keys. No, not like the sound. That was the sound. My heart skipped a beat. I pulled out a set of keys, praying to a God that I didn't believe in, that his car keys wasn't on here, so that maybe there was a chance that this guy had just left in a hurry. Nope. It was there, and it was bright and bold. A brand new shiny car key sat on the chain. It had a large Lexus symbol on the center. Great, I said aloud. Now what? I took a moment to think about the situation and what it might entail. Could I really do this? On my first ever solo exploration of a mine? Could I really go all fucking Robocop and run around in the darkness like some dumbass video game character? I decided, and to my detriment, that yes I could, and yes I did. Because I was an idiot. What I should have done looking back was fucking run out of that place and go to the police. But I didn't. Instead, I started looking for signs of which direction the guy went, and much to my surprise, I found it. A thin piece of twine was still hanging from a support beam at the entrance to the tunnel furthest to the left. I wanted to make sure it was his though, and I checked the other tunnels and could find no twine. But then, was there even any in his pack at all? I opened it and upended the bag, spilling the contents onto the cold, dusty floor. And there, in all their glory, I could see all that was left of the man's belongings. I decided I should probably take the pack with me in case I found the guy. And so I started replacing the items one by one to get a good inventory. And I placed the torch and the water bottles back inside, along with his wallet, the batteries and his oxygen monitor. The fact that the monitor was there had started to play on my mind. What if he had passed out and suffocated, and now me, being a dumb fuck, was about to follow this guy into the exact same fate? But I had my monitor, and now also a backup, and so I guessed I'd be okay. I then picked up a coat from the floor. It was the size of a small raincoat, dark blue. I searched the pockets and found some old gum wrappers and a small compass. Underneath the coat were another set of keys. It looked like they were for a locker, maybe, and a bundle of twine, still wrapped in plastic. I held the twine up and shone my torch on it, and walked over to the twine hanging along the side of the left tunnel wall. It looked the same, pretty much, aside from the light dusting of dirt on the used twine. I figured this was the best lead I had, and so I decided to follow it. I gathered up my things and hooked both oxygen monitors to my belt and turned them on. They beeped to tell me that they were on and working, and I tied his backpack to the front of mine using the elasticated cables on the front of my own bag and slung them over my shoulders. And I began walking into the tunnel. It was a steady decline, and as I got further in, I noticed it got quite damp. The rock was slippery and had a moistened sheen to it. I could hear the dripping of water coming down from the ceiling. Maybe this is what happened. Maybe he slipped. Maybe he hit his head. On and on into the unrelenting darkness I pressed, when all of a sudden it hit me. The rails had ended quite a while back, and there were no ore chutes down here at all. I had been so transfixed on finding this person that I had failed to notice that obvious visual signs of a reason to actually mine this tunnel had disappeared. Maybe this is a service tunnel that links up somewhere further in the network, I thought to myself. If it was, this mine had to be pretty big for how long the tunnel went on without any offshoots. I kept checking the twine as I walked, mindful that once or twice my oxygen monitors had pinged at me before returning to normal. Obviously, it can't be too bad down here. The guy had enough oxygen to still rationally think about putting these guidelines up. No sooner had I had this thought, the twine fucking ended. Like right there in the darkness, it just drooped down to the floor. And there, on the ground, lay a little cardboard reel. The guy kept going, without a fucking guideline. What the hell was he thinking? I decided that I would keep going for another half an hour down this tunnel. I had set an alarm on my watch, and if I didn't find anything, fuck it, I would leave and go to the police. Onwards I walked, making sure to leave my own trail, even though it was a straight shot, when finally I came to a small alcove. In the alcove I saw sweet wrappers which looked fairly new, and also the crusts of a sandwich. Doesn't like crust, huh? I said to myself. I knew what I was doing. I was humanizing this guy as much as I could because I was terrified of finding myself lost down here with some murdering psychopath. Every little aspect I found of this person, I fixated on a positive light. It was at this point I realized just how terrified I was. Every little aspect I found of this person, I fixated on in a positive light. It was at this point I realized just how terrified I was. My fucking hands were shaking as I picked up the sweet wrappers. I bent down to pick up the crusts from the sandwich. They were hard and stale, but held no mold on them, despite how wet the rest of the tunnel was. And so they can't have been more than a day or so old, I thought to myself. I wasn't sure how to feel at that point. On the one side I was elated, thinking to myself, holy fuck, this guy might actually be alive. And then, on the other, I was thinking, oh shit, there's a guy down here with me somewhere. So I moved further down the tunnel and away from the alcove. I kept walking until finally I came to another junction. Although this one, it wasn't like the other. It was large, much larger, and extremely cold. I could see the frozen particles from my breath in the air, whipping around in a light from my torch. I stood for a moment, regarding the room. There was, again, a small shack structure off to the side, and this time, 5 tunnels, although 2 of them looked much smaller than the others. I looked around the edges of the room, trying to see if I could find a further trace of the guy I was looking for. And that's when I heard it. Somewhere, far off deep in the darkness, there was a sudden snarl. My fucking heart was in agony from the pure, unbridled fear that set into my body. My legs actually gave way beneath me, and I let out a small cry of fear. My flashlight fell to the floor as I did, and, of course, the bulb shattered instantly. I lay on the ground, trembling. Maybe it was my imagination. I could only hope. I felt something warm under my hand. I took out my phone to illuminate it. My forearm was badly torn open, and I felt my stomach lurch at the sight of my exposed flesh, and then once again at what I had torn it on. There, right in the center of what looked to be a wooden covering for some sort of access ladder to an even deeper level of the mine, was a white piece of leg bone. How did I know this? Because just underneath the wooden cover, I could see through the slats, was a foot. And the foot was not bone. Around halfway down the ankle, there began a trail of badly torn flesh, and further down, below the wooden slat, there was a shoe covering the lower part of the foot, the skin of which was a deep bluish-grey colour. The shoe itself, a low-cut boot, was stained with a deep brown. I recoiled instantly, realising I had cut my forearm open on the splintered end of human remains. My stomach was doing somersaults and my brain was working overtime, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, when suddenly my wristwatch's alarm blared out at me. I'm not ashamed to say that in that moment I vomited from pure fear. This sheer level of absolute and utter terrific fear that coursed through my body was too much for me to deal with. I fumbled clumsily for my watch, holding my phone screen up to it so that I could see better. In the end, I managed to silence the beeping and allowed myself a moment to catch my breath. My head was pounding in agony. All I could think was, what the fuck? What the fuck do I do? I tried to collect myself, breathing out slowly through pursed lips and deeply in through my nose. I didn't know if the metallic smell was from the bloody body part next to me or the rusted metal tools scattered around the room. I tried to convince myself it was the latter. So many things were rocketing through my mind. The snarl, the foot, the belongings I'd found. Oh, what the fuck do I do? I sat up from leaning on the backpacks. I listened intently in the darkness as my phone screen faded to black once again. I couldn't hear a thing, not the faintest noise. I studied the leg more closely. Whoever it had belonged to clearly got it stuck in that wooden cover. But how the fucking fuck did they snap one of the strongest damn bones in the body in half like that? And even if they had managed to sever the leg through sheer force, how did the flesh get stripped from it? I rose to my feet. I was leaving. I opened the other rucksack and pulled out the other flashlight. It was dim as hell. I changed the batteries and still, it was so dim I could barely see anything in front of me. I collected my belongings and the other person's backpack once again, and then I realized there were another 2 fucking tunnels I hadn't noticed behind me. I had absolutely no fucking clue which way I had come. The twine, I thought to myself, and just as I had the idea, another awful noise came crashing through the tunnels like a tsunami of sound. A horrifying sound that sounded halfway between an animalistic snarl and a blood-curdling scream rang out from deep within one of the tunnels, and then reverberated around the room that I was in. I ran to each tunnel, frantically looking for the twine in the dim torchlight. When I finally found it, my heart gave a leap. But as I looked up into the darkness of the tunnel, walking without light. Let's get straight into that. My insides turned to ice. There, barely reflected in the dim light of the stranger's torch, were 2 pinpricks low down to the ground, and they were fucking moving. They looked as though they were coming closer at some speed. I sprinted back into the room, frantically looking around for somewhere to hide, and I spied the shack and dived into it, crawling backwards inside until I was up against the wall. As I had jumped in, I had once again dropped my only source of light, and it rolled into the room beyond. I peered through a gap between the old, rotten-smelling, dampened wooden beams used for the walls of the shack, and I waited, my heart thumping in my ears. A shuffling sound came closer and closer, until finally I watched in abject horror as a spindly, humanoid-looking thing came into the room on all fours, a little like a monkey would, as though it had the use of 2 legs but preferred to move using its arms also. It was grey all over and looked emaciated. Its long ribs and spine had skin sucked to them, as though it had no fat or muscle at all. In the dim light of the torch that had rolled away from me, its eyes, they reflected green halos. And its arms and legs, which stretched out, were impossibly long and ended with sharp, yellow and fetid nails that looked as though they could tear flesh from bone. It grunted and breathed a raspy, shallow sound as it stalked around the room, sniffing the air with 2 pits in the centre of its face, much like the way the nose of a skull looks, but with that grey skin covering the bone. It moved towards the leg in the middle of the room, stopping to sniff at my original broken, shattered torch. As I sat there, watching this unbelievable monstrosity, I shifted slightly in my position, and as I put my hand out to steady myself, as I felt like I was about to pass out, I felt something sticky, yet wet and cold. I ever so slowly turned my head to the side, and my eyes were met with a scene the likes of which visit me in my nightmares every time I try to go to sleep. There, in the dank bowels of this mine, where this creature, whatever it was, called home, his face gaunt and a look of exhaustion upon it, with clouded eyes and dried lips, was the man from the driver's license that I had found. It was then that my body failed me yet again. I felt my genes slowly saturate, and the smell and heat of my urine slowly lifted up to meet my nose. I clapped a hand harshly over my mouth, and tears began to stream from my eyes. The man looked as though he had died horribly. He had deep gashes in his abdomen and his neck, and blood was staining his clothes and skin a deep brown. On his left leg there was a sudden end, where splintered bone jutted painfully out from a torn and slashed stump of mottled flesh. I realized that most of his blood hadn't dried yet, as he could only have died a day ago at most. He obviously had bled out. His shoe matched the other one I'd found. That thing had torn his leg in half, snapping the bone. It must have. How the fuck else did it happen? And I sat in the darkness, silently sobbing and shaking violently, fighting the urge to vomit a second time. And the creature seemed to have sensed something was in the room, because it now had moved away from the leg that it had pulled out from the floor with a mighty cracking sound I had begun licking and biting at, and then stalked around the room slowly. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut as it moved out at the torchlight. I dared not move. I held my breath. I was petrified, frozen in place, apart from my violent shaking that seemed like it should have been producing the loudest noise you could imagine. There was a creak as a wooden beam somewhere else in the room seemed to struggle under the weight of the rock above. The creature made a noise as it had moved suddenly, and I opened my eyes slightly to see it slowly crawl back across the shaft of light from the dim torch. Its hollow eyes unmoving, but its head was jerking and twisting violently, side to side, up and down at strange angles. Is it blind? I thought in a moment of clarity, which lasted all of 10 seconds, as suddenly my weight seemed to shift on its own accord against the wooden beam, and a loud squealing creak slipped from within the wooden structure, followed by what had to be the loudest crack of splintering wood I'd ever heard in my life, no doubt amplified in my mind by the circumstances I found myself in. I froze, hard, and stared straight ahead, bolt upright, as the creature's face already began to lean into the shack's doorway from the darkness. Its mouth hung open, revealing 2 rows of horribly sharp teeth, but they were not uniform. They looked rotten, broken and jutting in all directions. The creature's pale gums were badly lacerated from a state of its teeth, and bloody saliva strings wobbled like a grotesque jelly in the thing's gaping maw. Its nose pit pulsed quickly as it sniffed the air, and it twisted its head, jerking violently as it had before, listening for the slightest of sounds. All of a sudden, it stopped, deathly still. Its mouth seemed to close ever so slightly. Even without a hint of human emotion or reaction, I could tell it had found something, or at least thought it had. I was practically passing out at this point, my hand wrapped so tightly over my mouth that my jaw hurt. Liquid, seeping from my nose, made its way down my hand, and my eyes blurred with tears as I stared at this nightmarish form in the darkness. I braced myself for the inevitable, exquisite pain of such an awful bite, wondering if it would be on my face, my neck, or shoulder, or maybe if it would simply plunge its long, spindly fingers into my stomach, using its jagged, sharpened nails to disembowel me. 1,000 different hideous scenarios played out in my mind over the next 5 seconds between the creature's apparent discovery and the moment when it sunk its claws into the remaining leg of the man beside me, and with a sickening cacophony of splitting, cracking bone, and the squelching or tearing of flesh, and the slapping sound of tendons snapping as they were pulled apart, it dragged the man halfway to the door, before his leg came away completely on the other side, allowing what little blood was left in his femoral artery to lazily seep out onto the floor, adding to the congealed mass of blood and gore already saturating the cold stone surface. It sort of bounded away into the room, greedily tearing at the leg of the stranger, and my suspicions were confirmed. It was blind. It didn't see me. It used smell and sound. The whole time that I was in the shack, I kept glancing back towards the tunnel where I had found the twine. I could see from where I was there was no way I was getting out of this room if it was in there with me. It took it less than 10 seconds to bound down that tunnel, and based on the size of its eyes when I saw them up close compared to the pinpricks I had seen reflected in them when it was in the tunnel, this thing, it can fucking move. I started going into survival mode. What can I use? I looked around. The man was clutching something in his hand. I peered closer. It was a photograph of a young woman. Sad, I thought, but not useful. My eyes flitted from one thing to another before my gaze rested on the stranger's backpack, which must have fallen from mine when I threw myself into the shack. I reached inside and pulled out a bottle of water. As slowly as I could, I stopped to check on the creature and saw it was still gnawing at the severed leg. I then inched my way forward from the wall and as gently as I could removed my own backpack from my back. Inside was my knife, which I took out and unfolded and lightly set down on the ground beside me. I decided my best bet was to distract the creature and make a dash for the tunnel. I moved to a crouch and, as quietly as I could, took aim down one of the furthest tunnels. With as much strength as I could muster, I hurled the bottle of water down the darkness of the tunnel, where the creature immediately pounced after it. I rose to my feet preparing to run when I heard the crunch of the plastic, followed by another angry snarl and thumping of bare feet on the stone floor approaching. Fuck, I thought as I slinked back into the darkness. What the fuck am I gonna fucking do? My mind screamed at me. I needed to get out of here, and by now my eyes had adjusted well to what little light the torch gave off, and so I could see around much more of the room. I tried desperately to search for something, anything in the room that would help me. I found nothing. The creature had returned to the center of the room now, continuing to devour the leg. I leaned my head back against the stone wall that the shack was built against, now crouching again. I opened my eyes and, in the dim torchlight, I could just about make out what looked like a sign on the wall. But it wasn't quite a sign. It had lots of squiggles and lines on it, almost like a map. I peered closer to it and studied it. I dared not get up and go closer, for fear that the thing would hear me, but under the thick layer of dust and grime, I could just about make out a "You're here" written by a large black dot. Just above it, written next to the entrance of the tunnel, in the center of the far wall from where the shack was, were the words, "Dangerous, air too low." I pondered the words for a moment, the creature's ever-clicking jaws rattling around my mind, before it hit me. My oxygen meters. I looked down, and by some fucking miracle, both of them were still clipped to my belt. I steadily removed one from the belt and took aim at the central tunnel. I held it as far as I could, and it disappeared into the deep darkness and clattered in the distance. The creature jolted up and stared in the direction of the tunnel. I waited, my heart again pounding in my ears. It twisted its head a few times, but when no further sound came, it went back to its meal. Fucking shit, I breathed, catching my breath out by daring to talk. Again, my hand clasped my mouth, but luckily the creature didn't hear. I reached down for the second oxygen meter, the stranger's, and held it to my chest. I breathed slowly through my nose. Please, 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 I mouthed. I took 2 steps forward as carefully as I could and leaned my body back. I followed through with the throw as hard as I could. It felt like an age before I heard another sound, but all of a sudden I heard a loud clatter. It sounded like it had broken. I felt like crying, but then, out of nowhere, a loud, constant alarm sounded from somewhere deep within the tunnel. The oxygen meter was blaring its warning out promptly and proudly, and the creature screeched violently and bolted down the tunnel. I took my chance. I ran as fast as I could, sprinting blindly into the darkness. I didn't even bother with the torch. I grabbed the end of the twine and started following it as best I could. And from behind me, I could hear the sound of the creature's angry cries. It was now following me. I could hear the sounds of its claw-like nails clattering on the rock, and I sprinted as hard as I could, forgetting about the twine completely. I whipped out my phone as I ran, desperately trying to unlock it, and I finally managed to, almost tripping multiple times in the process and nearly dropping the knife I still clutched in my right hand. And I turned on the flashlight and used it to quickly find the twine once more, desperately running for my life. My chest was burning and my throat felt like it was on fire. All at once, I came to a sudden, earth-shattering stop as the ground shot up to meet my chin. My jaw cracked painfully as I realized I could feel a horrifically sharp pain stabbing through my lower right leg. I span onto my back, finding myself staring straight into that hideous mouth of the creature. Its entire weight holding me down, and pieces of rotted flesh fell down onto my face. I panicked, kicking and trying desperately to get the thing off of me. I turned to my side, squinting my eyes shut, preparing for the worst, when I remembered the knife. My eyes bolted open. I was still holding it. I brought my knee up as hard as I could into the creature's right side. It moved its arm back in surprise, and I used this chance to bring the knife flying up and drove it as hard as I could into its eye. The creature reeled in pain, screaming and screeching violently. It fell backwards into the tunnel. I didn't miss a beat. I rolled over and shot up to my feet, snatching my phone up from the ground, and was once again running as hard and as fast as I possibly could. And before I knew what was happening, I was back at the junction where I'd found the backpack. Luckily, there were only 4 tunnels in this one, the 3 that had been next to each other and the one against the far wall, which I had come through originally. I again sprinted my way into the darkness, my phone my only source of light. I had hoped maybe that horrid thing might have given up after I'd hurt it, but no. I could hear it once again gaining ground on me, and this time it sounded even more determined. Its vicious snarls echoed all around. I couldn't tell if it was water dripping onto my neck, my own sweat, or the creature's bloodied saliva, but I wasn't stopping to find out. I burst out of the tunnel and into the very first junction I had come to. My heart felt like it was about to burst at this point, and I stood for less than a second before making my way to a top speed once again towards the tunnel I had taken, remembering that there was an old oil lamp sat next to the rails at its mouth. As I rushed up the steady incline, the creature's predatory grunts and snarls seemed never far behind. I felt the air change as I ran, feeling a rushing breeze that I almost smiled, feeling a flow of air crashing into me as I finally burst from the entrance to the mine. Night had fallen. I had no idea how. It was early morning when I arrived, yet stars backlit the desert landscape and framed the distant mountains in twinkling diamonds. I didn't stop running. I kept going down that trail, falling over a few times and scrambling back to my feet. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled in my pockets for my keys. I could hear the inhuman howls in the distance, echoing across the empty landscape. I dropped them twice before finally getting into my car, and with all the force and determination of a drag racer, I pulled my car violently onto the dirt road and skidded out onto the trail back towards the highway. It wasn't until I was back at the motel that I realized my arm was still bleeding, and pretty badly. In fact, I was quite surprised I hadn't passed out. I made my way to an emergency room and was seen to fairly quickly. The doctor asked how I had done this, and also he inquired about the other numerous bruises, scrapes and cuts on my face and arms. He took notice of my filthy face also, and when I answered him simply with, "I fell in a mine," he told me I would need to get jabs for tetanus, that I shouldn't be going into places like that, and that they were dangerous. You have no fucking idea, mate, I said, to which he responded with an arched eyebrow, before I shook my head dismissively and thanked him. He treated my gash on my arm and also gave me a dressing for the puncture wounds on my lower leg. Then he left the room and told me to wait there. I breathed out and in deeply, and finally felt myself begin to calm down from the adrenaline rush. He came back in and gave me a shot. I thanked him again and told him I would arrange payment through my medical insurance. He shook his head, telling me to talk to the girl on the desk out front in ER, and I nodded and thanked him once more. Just as I turned to leave, he stopped me. "Son?" I turned around and he had a concerned look on his face and gestured for me to look at the back of my jeans. They were stained with dried blood. I shrugged and lied to him. Yeah, they're ruined. Rusty metal. And I walked out. I returned to the UK some time after this, and I have never spoken to another person about what happened out there. I never wanted to and never felt like I had to. Until recently, I started seeing things that weren't there and having audio hallucinations too. I had nightmares constantly and lost my job because of how tired I was. I eventually was told by a close friend that maybe I should see a therapist, which I reluctantly did. She was very nice and understanding and assured me that she had to respect patient confidentiality, and the only time she could break this rule is if I told her I was going to kill somebody, and then she was allowed to warn that person. It took me a long time, but I finally confided in her. And when I did, she treated my story with a lot of skepticism, which I fully understood, being a skeptic, as I said before, myself. In the end, she came to the conclusion that there was no monster, and that maybe I had simply found a dead body and had a nervous breakdown. Maybe she's right, but there are nights, a lot of them, when I lie in bed thinking deeply about the events of that summer, how real it all felt, and I just can't bring myself to dismiss it all as a hallucination. I hadn't had a nervous breakdown when I found that backpack, and those scars on my leg and arm are real. All I can say in the end is that, thanks to my therapist, I'm still a skeptic. Maybe it was all in my head, but what I can say is this: I will never, ever go exploring abandoned places, least of all mines, again. And there isn't a single fucking thing in this world that would change my mind. Wow, 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 wow. Another one, wow. Absolutely chest-pounding, deep subterranean story there from the fantastic Gemini-IX over on Reddit No Sleep. Big thank you to the author for allowing me to narrate their incredible story on the show. I really hope you enjoyed my rendition, and look forward to more of your incredible writing in the future. Of course, as ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things, why not get in touch with myself at the usual email as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. New PC was set up and running, guys, back in action and full steam ahead. Make sure you got your notification bell set to all notifications to stay up to date with all the uploads that will be coming over the next few days. Plan to be knocking out hours and hours of audio. Got some fantastic content that was meant for the Halloween specials. Bear with me as I get all of that together and bring it to you guys as soon as possible. Of course, as ever, I hope you're all well and happy and keeping fit and focused during these testing times. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.